Today I'll be talking about the Islamic State of Khorasan and how this is sort of an evolution of terrorism from what we've previously seen before this organization. And uh, since this is much closer to my current day job, I probably need to throw in at least the disclaimer that all the information presented here is from public domain. And these are my views and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So, next slide.
But you're speaking for Biden directly, basically.
Oh, sure. Some of the topics we'll be covering today are the origins of the Islamic State of Khorasan, how it differs because you'll find by the end of this it's very malleable. So there are different ways in which it is very similar to other groups like Al Qaeda that we're more familiar with, and other ways where it differs somewhat. Then I'll talk about its initial strategies from its beginnings in 2015 all the way to engagements against U.S. forces while Operation Resolute Support was still in progress, and engagements against the Taliban from 2019 to 2020, and ISK after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan to the present. And so the Islamic State of Khorasan, or for brevity's sake, ISK, emerged during a time of transition. From the U.S. NATO side of it, it was a time of transition between 2014 and 2015. Operation Enduring Freedom, the official combat operations of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, was drew to a close that December, and January 1st to 2015 was the beginning of the NATO Train, Advise, and Assist mission, known as Operation Resolute Support. And the concurrent Operation Freedom Sentinel, which was the U.S. only counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan from 2015 to 2021. So groups like the Taliban are aware that this is occurring, and there are adjustments that are taking place. This is a time of transition for U.S. and NATO forces, but it's also a time of transition for jihadist movements in the region and throughout the Middle East. Prior to 2016, the Taliban was beginning to show interest in negotiations with the U.S. for some kind of settlement. And this weakened their image in the eyes of many of the jihadists in the area. It made them appear softer than the people that they originally looked to as like the main defiers of the United States. So this sort of tarnished their reputation in some of the more hardline elements. Also, Afghanistan and even Iraq are no longer really the cause célèbre of jihadists by 2011. Syria has now become the place to be for jihadist movements. Next slide.
This was right at the peak of ISIS, right?
Yes, and so as its precursor,
Al Qaeda in Iran.
Yes, and so by 2012, Al Qaeda is actually getting volunteers from Afghanistan and Pakistan to go over to fight in Syria against the fracturing Assad regime. And they even are able to convince the Taliban to do likewise. And if you're wondering how they did that, it comes down to simply Al Qaeda had money and the Taliban needed money. So they sent these contingents of volunteers to join al-Nusra, the Syrian branch of Al Qaeda. I think it officially declared itself such in 2013. But when these contingents got there, it turned out rather than joining up with al-Nusra, they found themselves more drawn to Islamic State Iraq, which was a precursor for the formalized Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Uh, and so in 2013, contingents from Pakistan and Afghanistan arrived in Syria. The following year, they start coming back. But the people who come back, rather than being Taliban and Al Qaeda, in many cases are coming back as ISIS converts. Yes.
Do we have any estimates on the number of people that were sent and then came back? Or do we know?
It's possible, and I would honestly say I was going to say this for the end, but if those numbers exist, it'd probably be in this book. I highly recommend this. It's going to be far more comprehensive than anything I'm talking about today. It's Antonio Gustosi's The Islamic State in Khorasan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the New Central Asian Jihad.
But Chris, just to kind of get aggregate, we're not talking 200,000 people. We're talking probably numbers in the under 10,000, under 20,000 realm. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they are still having to fight in Afghanistan against coalition forces, so they can only spare so many people.
One of the other things that happened in early 2011, of course, was that bin Laden got invited to explain himself to Allah.
Oh, yes.
Part of that same raid was the U.S. captured a whole bunch of computers. So the Hawala networks that Al Qaeda had been using to pay people were out of commission for months while they tried to repair their secure relationships. That probably affected where they could put them.
And it also probably affected Al Qaeda itself in terms of jihadists that were perhaps looking towards something new. And so the returning volunteers that came back to Afghanistan and Pakistan were often ISIS converts. So by August of 2014, pamphlets start showing up along the Pakistani side of the border, written in both the Pashto and Dari, that are announcing the coming expansion of ISIS into Khorasan. Khorasan historically is this region that spans across areas of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. So this is a large area, and it's harkening back to another time. By November, there are rumors of a training camp in Kunar, which is one of these more eastern provinces along the mountainous border with Pakistan. And by January of 2015, the same month that Resolute Support and Freedom Sentinel begin, Hafiz Saeed Khan is selected to be governor of the Waliyat Khorasan, or the new Islamic State of Khorasan. And he was selected for two main reasons. One, he was early on when they first started mobilizing volunteers to go to Syria, he was the one who orchestrated the first contingents and was involved in fighting in Syria. So he made a name for himself, and to the point where he personally gained the respect of al-Baghdadi. He was, those two factors moved him to the top ladder. So what do they believe? Their ideology, in some ways, is similar to that of Al-Qaeda, but one significant difference is that Al-Qaeda tended to work with diverse jihadists that shared common goals and beliefs, that as long as you shared certain core goals, if you were parts of different jihadist groups, we could work together. And Al-Qaeda tended to organize itself in cadres, whereas by contrast, ISIS and ISK insist on trying to build a conventional style army rather than these smaller units. and they and they insisted that you subscribe to one single unifying ideology, which was, of course, theirs. They also turned Clausewitz's concept of war as politics by other means on its head. In their mind, warfare is the business of government, and that is the primary function of any state. That military engagement with its enemies is what makes should be the main focus of statehood, which means that they should have very little interest in things like infrastructure, public works. They were more. It was in some ways they borrowed from a quib about the Kingdom of Prussia centuries earlier, that Prussia was a military with a country rather than vice versa. And so that's their organizational model. Something reminds me of something of that. They want to establish a caliphate just as Al Qaeda did, but Al Qaeda was very phased about it. The caliphate was more of a long-term goal in their mind that they were aspiring towards, that they had to clear certain phases before they got to that. ISK intends to leapfrog that and just establish the state, and we'll figure it out from there. Their goals are very apocalyptic in nature. They see themselves as heralding about the final days and the last judgment, and so this puts them in the mentality that they don't actually care if everybody else on Earth is their enemy. Now they do put some hierarchy to enemies, but it's very flexible and fluid. The near enemy more important than the far enemy. In many ways, this seems like, well, we're talking about geography, but in a lot of ways, for them, it's more of whoever's the enemy that is currently the biggest problem that you're dealing with face to face is the issue. Even though it's like the United States is the issue, gaining supremacy over local competitors is equally as important as, and if they're the most pressing issue, that's the priority, not this sequential approach to dealing with one's enemies. And they also seek to establish themselves as the supreme defender of Sunni Islam. Next. So this brings to their methodology. Early on, they maintained their relationships with the organizations they were previously affiliated with. And they gave the impression that they were still, I'm part of this new movement, but we're also still all working together for a common goal. So they maintained in the beginning their networks with Al Qaeda and the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban. And this is an interesting feature about ISK, is that they have a hard ideology, but they're extremely pragmatic in how they apply it. And so even though they are simultaneously undermining all of these groups in terms of taking recruits away from, poaching their numbers, they're also employing a divide and rule policy. They are deliberately inflaming tribal divisions and social tensions within groups like the Taliban in order to capitalize on disarray between them in hopes of poaching or denigrating those previous organizations.
What do you mean by TTP?
Oh, that's the Pakistani Taliban.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Sorry.
I know about 4 different
names
that correspond to that acronym. So
Force of
Army
Army.
acronym.
Tactics, techniques, and procedures. I know.
Oh, no, I didn't. And excessive force as a deterrent strategy. And this is also a very interesting way of putting it there, because they're pragmatic with it. Like when they display violence, it's extreme. They celebrated their founding in January of 2015 by beheading a local police officer. So their violence when employed is excessive. But, next slide, please. They are keen to avoid collateral damage. They don't want they initially start out far less prone to suicide attacks than their competitors. Partially because they want to maintain themselves as the defenders of or as a better option, and then they don't want to kill any potential new recruits they might get. They're also trying to build their numbers while somewhat laying low, while still pretending to be friends with Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Another aspect of their approach is very early on, they employ an officer corps training concept to their organization. They include trainings in tactics, communications, bomb making, weapons usage, intelligence, and management. How to not just how to use these weapons, but how to get soldiers to follow your lead. They even attempted early on to establish their own madrasas. This was a way of maintaining cohesion with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, that the ideology would be unfiltered by opening up ISK-specific schools in the region to maintain that link to their central ideology. But as time went on, this became more and more difficult. Their links to ISIS were strained, largely because the international coalition in Operation Inherent Resolve had them embattled there, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to coordinate in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They're also still working on structure and recruitment well into 2017, and eventually the Taliban caught on to what they were doing and realized that you're not working with us so much as undermining us and behind our backs. So early attempts to coalesce were hindered by three sides. The ISK is now having to deal with threats from the Taliban itself, the Afghan National Security Forces, and U.S. and coalition forces. And by 2017, Secretary of Defense Mattis and the commanding general of U.S. Forces Afghanistan, General Nicholson, make a concerted effort to concentrate on the annihilation of ISK. So a lot of Operation Freedom Sentinel starts focusing on ISK specifically. They target their strongholds in Kunar and Nangarhar provinces, which are at one point, much earlier in the war in Afghanistan, were former Al Qaeda strongholds. So you can see how the demographics have changed from Al Qaeda controlled areas to ISK ones.
Do you know if they were the same people typically?
A lot of times, yeah, because they're drawing numbers from these older organizations.
It's basically two different but related franchises, like the switching out the Burger King sign for the.
One way I've heard it described is it's actually very generational too. By this point, a lot of these new members of this new organization may not have even been alive when 9/11 occurred. And so there's actually this sort of mentality that's like, oh, Al Qaeda's the boomers of terrorism. It's like we've got new ideas. We're fresh and have new ideas. Their time's past. So
boomers, there's a fun for you.
Oh God, I wish I'd seen that coming.
You need to put that in the next version of the slide.
Oh, jeez. How do I recover from that?
Sorry,
but U.S. forces begins a scorched earth policy, exponentially increased bombing campaigns. Patrols with Afghan commandos, setting up patrols and ambushes. There's one quote of it was intercepted communications over a radio. That one member of ISK is like they burned everything. I don't even have clothes anymore. They start, yeah, you feel bad for the guy. They start, it sucks to suck, but but they also begin targeting key leadership. Khan from who was the original founder in 2016, 2015, he was killed by U.S. forces in 2016. His successor, Sheikh Abdul Hasib, shared his fate in the following year. So after pounding ISK positions very heavily, what was left of them took from the playbook of the Taliban and Al Qaeda from years before and used the mountainous border with Pakistan to slip through anyone they could. The U.S. was quite familiar with this by that point. So rather than attempting to control the area, they settled on a containment policy. If we can just keep them boxed in for now, we can deal with them as needed. Now, after all of this pressure, by 2018, ISK has taken some significant losses, so they have to switch to more overt activities. And they end up being more extreme and less pragmatic. Next week. Now, as they are setting themselves up as the extreme defenders of Sunni Islam, a distinction that the Shia Hazaras do not share, they escalate targeting of the Hazara population in central Afghanistan, leading to one event, the Mazar-e-Olange massacre, in which they just went house to house, killing, I think, over 50 people, and as a result, the ISK leader, Kari Hekmatullah, was killed shortly thereafter in April of 2018. But this massacre was enough of an attention grabber that President Ghani of Afghanistan at the time commented that this war has entered a completely new phase. You have different participants than you have seen previously. Women start playing a prominent role in ISK. They're active on social media for recruitment purposes, study madrasas. Sometimes they're even involved in the attacks themselves. Also, one thing that separates ISK from the Taliban is the majority of Taliban are Pashtun. And so if you are not Pashtun living in Afghanistan and you don't particularly like the Taliban, then ISK would like to talk to you, because you see groups like Tajiks and Uzbeks joining the ranks of ISK, areas that the Taliban would be ill-pressed to be able to recruit from. And also, in response to this, the Taliban becomes more radicalized and violent in response, in trying to compete with ISK as the dominant. And unlike the Amir Mansur's approach, he was killed in 2016 and replaced by Hibatullah Akhundzada, who I believe is the one who is still in charge of the Taliban today. At the time when he was replaced, Mansur's approach of seeking negotiation was replaced by a more brutal approach to conducting warfare, increasing suicide attacks and whatnot. Next. However, by 2019, the Taliban are also starting to warm up to the idea of resuming negotiation. And so you have the U.S. and Taliban engaging in peace negotiations that eventually result in the Doha Agreement. At this time, you see a decrease in direct attacks from by the Taliban against like U.S. and NATO forces, although that was breached from time to time, threatening the negotiation process. COVID-19 also presented a cause for less activity in terms of just not being able to engage one way or another. And then finally, you have the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. ISK, while the U.S. and the Taliban are diminishing their activities against each other, that's not to say that the Taliban was not still targeting Afghan security forces. But ISK was still active during this time, all the way to withdrawal, with perhaps one of their more famous attacks is that during the withdrawal from Kabul in 2021, where ISK launched the Abbey Gate attack that killed 13 Americans and over 170 Afghans. So that was ISK's final blow during America's war in Afghanistan, but it is still very much active and trying to rebuild itself. And that is part of the reason that in October of 2021, Operation Enduring Sentinel began. And there is not a lot of information on this, and I don't think that it's going to change anytime soon. But at least as terms of its official public mission statement, it is an over-the-horizon operation to curtail extremists from launching attacks from Afghanistan. That's the extent of any information on that operation at this point. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a generational divide. So here, where are we at today? And in many cases, literally today, as I was able to include a bit of news report I heard this morning. After the U.S. withdrawal, social media had already been a cornerstone of ISK's like methodology. Like this was how they recruited people. But what we've seen most disturbing, particularly over the last year, is how frequent it is used. Things like TikTok and social media of that nature to reach minors. That increasingly the people who are being arrested to carry out attacks for ISK are teenagers, and often living in places like Europe. And you see an escalation in their attacking. As I said, it's not sequential. If they see an opportunity against someone they don't like, which is pretty much everybody else on earth, they will take it. For example, we had an unusual conversation with Iran. We don't usually talk to them, but we gave them warning that there was a potential impending attack. And sure enough, on January 3rd, during the ceremony of Soleimani, there was a bombing in Kerman, Iran, that killed 95 people there. March, that was followed by a bombing at a concert outside of Moscow that killed over 137 people.
We also warned the Russians then too, right?
We did. It's like, look, I know it's one of those, like, you have that one neighbor. It's like, I know we have our differences, but that jerk in 3B has to go. And so prior to the Olympics, there was an increase in security in France and Germany, and they made several arrests of teenagers that were affiliated with ISIS that had constructed bomber belts and other explosives intended to attack the Paris Olympics. August 8th, a Taylor Swift concert is canceled in Vienna after a planned suicide attack is thwarted. And that one's interesting because that was probably the most interest my 9-year-old daughters have ever shown in my work. All the way to this week, October 7th, uh, oh, which was this, I missed this, the story, it was announced just this morning that on Monday, Afghan national Nasir Ahmad Tahidi, 27 years old, has been arrested as he had been accumulating weapons with the intention of going to an election polling station on election day next month. And just yesterday, the chief of British sort of MI5 warned of exponential growth of the terror threat. That a third of the priority cases that are currently being investigated by MI5 are focused on overseas terror threats that include ISK. And 1 out of 8 of each of the suspects being investigated currently are minors. And so that is the emerging pattern that we see up to the present day. And that's all I have on that.
So one question, are you seeing any influence of them trying to declare a border and separate independent state? Or are they just trying to have warlord control of their territory?
It seems very much like like with ISIS, is this the cart before the horse? You declare the state and then worry about forming it. And I missed one key. This last one, the one that occurred this week, this was in Oklahoma. So this is not a European. This is not something. This is spread beyond Europe at this point.
Do these individuals, for example, the one in Oklahoma and the one in Indiana, do they actually have a connection to ISIS and are they getting funding from them, or is it more so their own initiative for which they declare they're doing it for ISIS?
Or is it a random bombing that ISIS takes responsibility for? Which
That's true. You can never know how many of them are just claimed. But in some cases, at least I know in European cases, they have said that they've actually found direct connections to like chief ISK members in Pakistan that were directing, I think, something that occurred in Sweden or Turkey. But in terms of Oklahoma, I'm not sure. And some, I'm sure it's a little of both. Some may have just been recruited through videos and just been enfranchised. Others may be getting information directly. So it just depends.
Well, as Hezbollah just found out, the Western countries can be surprisingly clever about intercepting cell phone and other electronic
Yes.
doing things about it. In fact, apparently they went to pages because they figured out their cell phone too easily penetrated.
Where is the ISIS main leadership now? Syria or Afghanistan or somewhere else?
Well, at this point, how interlinked they are is difficult to say. ISK is more of an affiliate that has tried to maintain its connections. So, but in terms of who's in a better position to be like the leader of an overall movement, that's hard to say. I mean, ISIS is clearly not out of the picture, but their heyday has come and gone, hopefully for good. And ISK is still in a. Now that the U.S. has withdrawn, they've had to sort of change their tactics, like where now the Taliban is their main competitor, and the Taliban is very doggedly pursuing them. So because ISK is a direct threat to their.
Really quickly, do you see in the future a scenario where the U.S. has to open relations with the Taliban to deal with ISK?
It's possible. I'm not even sure I'd say I'd be surprised to find out that that's already the case to some level. As I said, I know that Enduring and Sentinel exists, but I couldn't tell you what it does.
Well, we tried to buy them off leading up. Found out they wouldn't stay alive. So then it was a question of finding people who would be would stay bought within the movement and work with them. I'm guessing, it's pure speculation.
And the Doha Agreement, part of that was that the Taliban had to ensure that Afghanistan would never be used as a launch pad for attacks against the US and its allies. And that seems to be at least one of the things they seem to be trying to adhere to, whether, although I'm sure they're doing it largely for their own interests.
We
Are
have
they still controlling any territory, or are they in the wind?
They, at this stage, it's hard to say. I would say they're probably more in the wind, but it's the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Who actually controls it is I guess depends on who you ask at any given time.
Yeah,
Depends
the
on who
couple-
they ask too.
And who they, yeah.
Pakistan, and again, Pakistan has firm policies about who can live in its basically uncivilized territories and who cannot. But then who actually enforces that is a different question. Now they enforce it.
Yes.
Julian and Jennifer both have questions. I did not see who asked first.
Jennifer, you can go first.
I knew Jennifer.
Okay, yeah, Jennifer, do you want to read your questions out loud?
Oh yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I know. I
Okay,
knew
so,
when I
the-
mentioned Syria, you would be.
Or the
oh yeah, no,
terrorist.
everything's Syria. I know anything else except Syria. Does ISK have a social media protection team to protect its enemies from shutting it down? Because I would think that the U.S. intelligence would be able to do this.
I feel like, yeah, it would probably be blocked. Now, I don't know about what that would mean in other countries. It does seem like it's more prevalent in places like Turkey and Europe, where more of the social media is getting more outreach. I must admit I know very little about ISK's tech department, so so I'm not sure exactly how they would get around those things. Yes.
If I can add to this, I've seen people on Twitter communicate with members of the Taliban, and I think ISK2 were TTP from Pakistan. So there's the outreach, and frankly, I don't think they're hiding. I think if you want to talk to them, you can talk to them. It's pretty weird, but yeah.
I mean, I remember jihadist groups in Syria having actual Twitter profiles,
Yeah.
and they would occasionally get suspended, but a lot of the time they were just left up. I remember there were some hilarious cases of even Hamas. They opened a Hebrew language Twitter account briefly, and there was a pretty hilarious, some pretty hilarious interchange. Like there was this one Israeli woman who politely corrected their grammar, and they told her thank you. But that was before the new regime on Twitter. But if kids are being radicalized on, say, TikTok,
And then
Yeah.
then when Jamal Khashoggi was killed, there was a bunch of what's his name, MSB people building all these Twitter accounts and stuff to denounce him as being a killer of Jamal Khashoggi, so that he would have more and more followers. It would make it seem that people were more against
Mm.
him killing Khashoggi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but
I wouldn't be.
I suspect that may would have happened in Syria if there's anti-Assad individuals creating social media accounts, then they're going to be shut down very quickly versus those that are pro-Assad in Syria.
I'm not sure that the Assad regime then or now had legal oversight over Twitter in the same way that the American authorities do.
No, but
Yeah,
I'm just talking about in Syria in general. And it depends on how much attention America was giving to overseas Twitter accounts. I don't know.
yeah.
It's a brand new area to me, so I'm not sure.
if I were heavily involved with the activism of the American Satan, I might be advocating rather than blocking those accounts, monitor them.
That may be why.
Yeah.
I don't think there's much interest. If they could, they would want, if they wanted to, I think they definitely would want it, but I don't think there's interest. I mean,
Monitor and maybe insert this information. I think there are possibilities.
All right. Julian?
Yeah, I've never been to Afghanistan, but I spent over 10 years working in Pakistan. So I have a question first and then a comment. Some of my students were the intel people when Canada was deployed in Afghanistan before we left in 2014, and they operated with the British in the western part of Afghanistan, where you have a lot of the drug manufacturing, and where I think some of this organization had its origin and was deployed. Is there any information on the link between the narco traffickers and this movement? And the reason I raised that is at least in the Canadian experience, most of the Talibs and these terrorist organizations were recruiting from landless, poor young kids, the sixth or seventh kid from a family. In other words, really the bottom of the barrel, where the narco traffickers had sat phones. They were mid-20s to mid-30s. They were part of a fairly sophisticated road network. And there was an encounter where the Vandus and the Gurkhas, the Vandus were providing a smaller contingent to clear roads, encountered some of the narco traffickers, and the narco traffickers were super organized. The Gurkhas were very fast. They put up a mortar. The narco traffickers got the hell out of there, and they're really well coordinated, which is the opposite profile that you'd have for Taliban or these various terrorist groups. But I'm wondering, is there any information on to what extent they depend on the narco traffic for their funding?
That's that's a good question, because so far I have not looked much at the narco trafficking angle of it. It did not. It surprisingly didn't come up. So, which normally with the Taliban, it's very much an active part of their fundraising. So, I now that you mention it, I am surprised that by its absence in the literature I've read so far. It makes me wonder if they approach that very differently.
One of the things some knowledgeable people thought was happening is 1 month a year when activity was way down. And the reason was that was the month of the poppy harvest. And those people could get paid better harvesting poppies than working for Taliban.
That makes sense. You go by the farming skill.
So if I could just share a comment from the Pakistani perspective. Again, I've never been to Afghanistan, but for the Pakistani interpretation is that given the religious culture of Afghanistan, which is Hanafi, in other words, it's really a mellow version of Islam where you've got saints and you can have intercessions. And I mean, this is, I mean, I would almost say a feminized version of Islam, but it's very, very different than the Hanbali fiqh or the legal traditions of the Arabs. And so any Arab type of Islam, whether it's from Arabia or Syria, that gets imported into Afghanistan, it comes up against this Barelvi culture. And this is a culture which shares some of the traditions with Hinduism in South Asia. They wither on the vine. And you can see with the Taliban already. And they used to have a prohibition against worshiping dead Taliban warriors, right? Because you're not supposed to get an intercession to get help from God. And so the Taliban would put up concertina wire on the cemeteries. But now the Taliban are going back to their Barelvi tradition, and the Al-e-Hadith, which is a political party that's almost as old as Pakistan, has been pushing for years to bring this sort of Orthodox Arab tradition into Afghanistan, and it's always failed. And Pakistan, it's always failed. So this group sounds like it's out of the gate self-limiting. I mean, it can certainly do terror in the Arab part of the world and do terror wherever there are Arab immigrants that are sort of dislocated immigrants. But in Afghanistan itself, they're basically doomed to fail or conversion. Hence, the Pakistanis are not concerned.
I guess it depends how adaptable they are morally.
Yeah, because from what I do know of the Pakistani side of it, like they have been also been putting a lot of pressure on ISK along the border regions as they've been asserting more security dominance in that part of the country. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's I feel like the ties between ISIS and ISK probably for ISK to work long term would have to splinter at some point, because even though the idea is sort of a unified ideology, as you said, it's it's very different part of the world than the Arab dominated area that ISIS emerged from. All the differences there, that ISK, whether they want to be unified with ISIS or not, is always going to have a very distinct flavor that